my name's Beatrice and I'm here with Kajsa Norman. Kajsa is an investigative journalist originally from Sweden, now living in London, and Kajsa documents conflict zones and has already written books on Zimbabwe, Cuba and Venezuela. Her most recent book is Bridge over Blood River, which documents the rise and fall of the Afrikaner in South Africa.
One of the first things that strike you as you arrive as a foreigner in South Africa, and maybe in Johannesburg in particular, is that there's this pervasive climate of fear. The white middle class essentially live in fortresses behind barbed wire. They have armed guards. They're reluctant to go out after dark. Some don't even stop at red lights when they're driving at night because they're so afraid of being carjacked. And this climate of fear is really contagious. And so I wanted to understand where it comes from.
Yeah.
There was one incident in particular that spurred my interest, and I attended an ANC Youth League demonstration in Johannesburg outside the stock exchange. And as I arrived and was waiting for the protesters to arrive, two Afrikaner bankers came up to me. And they said, what are you doing here? You're white. You can't just be standing in the streets. You're obviously not South African. And I told them that I was there to watch the demonstration and to take photos. And they said, well, come up to our balcony and you can take your pictures from there where you'll be safe. I said, no, thanks. And said that I preferred to stay down at the street level. And anyway, they went back up, and I stayed on the sidewalk, and the demonstration, started. And as I was debating whether I should enter the river of people or kind of stay on the sidelines, I stood back and I had this sensation that I was being watched, and so I looked up and I could see, the faces of the bankers and the stock exchange brokers. They all kind of had their eyes glued to my blonde head in the crowd. And I was kind of overcome by the sensation that they wanted something bad to happen. They didn't have the expression of concern that they had expressed when they came down to speak to me. But instead, I got the sense that they were hoping that this black violence that they had been raised to fear would be realized so that they could be proven right. And that was a really scary feeling, but it also made me really intrigued to understand, where does this fear come from? How do you become a person that wants to see your own country fail? And so that's what made me kind of dig into the history of the Afrikaners.
And in your book, you kind of cover a spectrum of resistance, or kind of a spectrum of reaction to this fear, and it kind of spans from people who own vicious or sort of menacing looking dogs and have a garage filled with tinned food, all the way up to people who believe that there are powerful organisations orchestrating or preparing for either an emergency evacuation or a race war in South Africa. And from living there, the idea that there might be such organisations in preparation, did you feel like that was true and a possibility, or did you feel like it was part of the kind of myth of post-apartheid Afrikaner fear?
Well, there's definitely a climate of paranoia, and it's hard to know how much of that fear is real and warranted, like how much is justified. But even if it's unjustified, it still exists, and I do believe that there are such organizations. Whether they have the following that they claim to have, I'm not sure. It's really hard to prove one way or another.
Yeah.
But that they exist, I don't doubt. There was also this myth that once Mandela passed, the blacks would rise up and take their vengeance, and a lot of Afrikaners did believe in that. As I mentioned in the book, many people have what they call a plan B, like you said, where they bunker up on food and fuel and these types of things, so that they're always prepared should this uprising come.
Yeah.
And you also have, Orania is also a reaction to that, where you have a community that chooses to isolate itself.
Yeah, tell us a bit about Orania and what it is and what it stands for.
So Orania is a whites-only society in the middle of South Africa in the arid Karoo region. It's kind of in the middle of nowhere. It's about halfway between Johannesburg and Cape Town. And there you have about 1,000 Afrikaners who have chosen to isolate themselves. They're afraid that if they assimilate into the new South Africa, their language, their culture, and eventually their entire people will be annihilated. And so they've chosen to trade the comforts of modern society for this existence where they can remain the majority and continue to dictate the rules.
Yeah, and so this identity of the Afrikaner as a sort of a chosen people, would you explain where that comes from and how it's sort of making post-apartheid life presumably much more painful and difficult and much more of an identity crisis than perhaps it would be if they didn't have this myth around being Afrikaner?
Right. Well, it started with the Battle of Blood River.
Which, of course, is the title.
Yeah, the title of the book, on December 16th in 1838. And so a few hundred Afrikaners were able to defeat a Zulu army of some 12,000 warriors. And in the process, they killed about 3,000 of them without losing a single man themselves.
Wow.
And so that's where the name Blood River comes from. It was said that the blood of these 3,000 dead soldiers or warriors tainted the water of the river red, hence the name. But anyway, this victory convinced the Afrikaners that they were a chosen people. They were a very religious people. And so about a week leading up to this battle, they had been making this pact with God, or a vow to God, if you will, where they had said that if you grant us victory when the battle comes, then we will build a church to honor your name, and we will celebrate the day of the victory as a holy day for generations to come. And
which, of course, it is still being celebrated.
It is still being celebrated, and because they won and such a stunning victory without a single loss, they were utterly convinced that this was a sign that they were a chosen people, and they took this date. Then the Afrikaner elite used December 16th as they started to weave the mythology of the Afrikaners as a chosen people, and that gave rise to then the nationalism that eventually became apartheid.
And from your book, sort of from writing your book, how has that affected your perceptions of the growth in far-right movements and nationalist movements in the UK and Europe and in America now as well?
I think that Europe and America can learn a lot from the story of the Afrikaner. When we speak about the rise of right-wing nationalism in Europe, people frequently bring up World War II or the rise of Nazi Germany. And I think that that's not the best example. I mean, the story of the Afrikaner is much more recent in time. And it allows us to see how you convince a people that they're superior to others, how you build that up, what happens to that people when they realize that is not true. And then and what happens to a people when they begin to feel that their culture is under threat. How do you kind of change your perspective on the world and this kind of protectionism that arises from that? And I think by studying that, we can learn a lot.
You say at the start of the book that sometimes it takes a perceived threat for society to articulate its narrative and its values. And I think that for a lot of people would ring true for so many countries and so many identities at this moment in time, that in reaction to the refugee crisis, that we're hearing much stronger assertions of national identity and something to be protected.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a really insightful comment. And I wonder whether it can be helpful or fruitful in any situation to react to an external threat through that sort of assertion of national identity.
Well, I think learning about the Afrikaner is in a way then telling us to get off our high horse, because I mean they're a fraction of the population. They're maybe 3% of the population of South Africa, and so no wonder they're feeling a threat to their culture. And if you know Europeans are experiencing this threat when there's maybe 15 or 20% immigration, when the different European nationalities are still the majority by far,
Yeah.
then how much more so will they feel it if they become the minority? And so, the Afrikaners have been very stigmatized and kind of written off in many parts of the world as racists and as the people of apartheid. And I think that's walking away from a valuable lesson. It can teach us a lot, and we may see a similar development or similar rises of movements here in within our own immediate area as well.